Each and every day, enjoy the Simple Six menu at Subway, an entire made-for-you meal featuring one of 6 inch sandwiches like the Italian BMT or Black Forest ham, with any bag of chips and a 21-ounce drink, all for only $6. Subway. Eat fresh.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The BS Report. The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report, a special day. Special day. People try to talk me out of this. I wouldn't be talked out of it. I made Chris Connelly come to the studio. He's here.
I'm here.
Chuck Klosterman is on the line. We're calling Bill James later. We're calling my buddy Jacko later. We're talking JFK assassinations. It's been 50 years. Multiple channels running programming basically every day. Chuck, I know you're watching this stuff. Don't pretend you aren't.
Did you watch Frontline last night?
It's on my DVR. I got sidetracked by David Blaine.
Oh, see, I watched the Kent State Ohio game, and then I was like, oh hey, it's like who is Lee Harvey Oswald?
Who is Lee Harvey Oswald?
I'm trying to remember when I met David Blaine. I met David Blaine when he was still going out with Fiona Apple at a Rock the Vote event that we all had our picture taken with Bill Clinton at. And Blaine was doing magic for everybody waiting to see Clinton.
Wow, that's interesting because I always heard David Blaine was even more dangerous around the ladies than Leo DiCaprio was because they were friends. So then you put Bill Clinton in the mix, and now you basically have a tree of people who are dangerous around the ladies.
I was lucky to leave with my wife.
Wait a second. Really I have a quick question. Okay, yeah. So David Blaine dated Fiona Apple. I know Fiona Apple was also with P.T. Anderson, and I think that she used to date the writer Jonathan Ames. What is her type? What is the unifying element in these dudes?
She also dated Dwight Howard. No, I'm making that up. Making that up.
That's Mary Carey or something.
Would have been. Oh, yeah, Mary Carey did date
with that guy from NSYNC, remember?
So, all right, let's spin this to JFK. So, 50 years later, people care as much as they ever had. I always felt like growing up, and especially when I went through my first cycle of being obsessed with this in high school and then in college, there's this feeling that down the road we'll have the answers. They're going to release this info that they've sealed for the public safety, whatever. And now I'm 44 years old. This assassination happened 50 years ago, and I feel like we still have no answers, Chris Connelly.
I was saying before that I think everybody my age, I'm 56, went through 3 weeks thinking the Violent Femmes were the greatest band in the world, and 3 weeks as assassination buffs, keeping up with the assassination on a really hardcore level.
So just 3 weeks, that's it, you're out.
Well, hardcore, like really hardcore for 3 weeks.
Right.
You know, I was watching TV when it happened. I was home from school.
You saw the whole, really?
Yeah, my mother was graduated first in her class from St. John's Law School, and I bring this up only because at the moment when the assassination happened, she was home ironing and watching a soap opera. So I had a half day from school that day, and I was watching the soap opera too on CBS when they interrupted programming.
Nowadays, you'd be like playing a game on your iPad.
Exactly.
In another room.
I would have had the hand up like Derek Jeter to the umpire. I wouldn't have even wanted to be bothered. But no, we watched the whole thing.
So when was your stage of being obsessed with it?
I remember, I guess in high school, I remember spending like 3 weeks doing a paper on it for school and being surrounded by all those self-published books. You know, Whitewash by Harold Weisberg, was that his name? And Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane, and all those books I remember scattered all over my room and sitting next to my electric typewriter and just really being freaked out.
Mark Lane's the guy who claims Jack Ruby was at the book depository and the Warren Commission cut out his face in the picture.
I actually thought that wasn't it Mark Lane who confused Lee Harvey Oswald with Billy Landlady? Was that his name? Some other guy who worked at the book depository who was downstairs and who from a distance looked like Oswald.
Heard his cause.
Yeah.
Chuck, when did you become obsessed?
Well, because, I knew we were talking about this later today. I'm kind of thinking about it all morning. I realized something. When I was 21, I was certain that there must have been some kind of conspiracy here. And I think that I probably believed it was the CIA. And when I was 31, I was more confused. I wasn't really sure how I felt about it. I knew more about it in some ways, less. And now, I guess I believe Oswald acted alone.
Wow.
And I have sort of a new, I shouldn't say it's a new theory because I'm sure not the first person who's had it, but I have a new idea of to me, what explains sort of the confusion and the weirdness of this event.
That's really interesting because that is almost exactly, I think your arc speaks for like many, many people. I think that's,
so.
And even for someone like me who like remembered what it felt like at the time and how terrifying it was.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely right. What's your new gloss on it?
Well, okay. What's the key aspect here that makes it seem conspiratorial? Of all the details surrounding this assassination, what is the thing that makes it seem the most suspect?
Is that a rhetorical question or a real question?
Well, I have an answer, but I'm wondering if you'll agree with my answer.
From a forensic standpoint, it's the quality of the autopsy and the work of the doctors. From an overall standpoint, it's who Oswald was. Oswald is somebody who can support any possible interpretation of the facts. Oswald who, like very few people in the culture, you almost might say Tupac or somebody like that. You can create like 4 or 5 different personas for Oswald, and each of them can work given the facts of his life. So I guess really who Oswald was.
I would have
now
that.
to me, my answer. Okay,
wait, hold on. I would also have Kennedy's brain just disappeared. It was just gone. Like some really shady stuff happened from the hour between when he's in the hospital to when his body was in the plane. Just a lot of weird stuff happened.
Those are all good responses, and they're all very good specific things. I guess in my response was, or the thing that I always felt that what lent itself most to believing there was a conspiracy is more of a general thing, which is just incredibly strange that Oswald was then murdered by a guy who had cancer, who kind of came out of nowhere, silenced him, and then died himself. So I always thought that, to me, was the strangest aspect of all of this, and the thing that really pushes forward any kind of speculation, because we don't have Oswald to question. He's not like, John Hinckley or Ciaran. Even these guys who don't say that much, he's not there, so we have no ability sort of to look at his side of the story. So, I was thinking that was always my belief, was that somehow proved that the organized crime was involved with this. Jack Ruby's appearance from Dallas to do this, that was the key problem. So last night while I'm watching Frontline, and I'm just kind of thinking about this, it's not even that related to the show, I started thinking about this. What if the thing that we're sort of underestimating, or maybe not talking about that much, is the idea that Oswald is this mentally ill person? Okay. He's a mentally ill person who attempted to kill someone before he tried to shoot anyone in Dallas. He tried to kill General Walker for reasons that are never totally clear. He kills a cop after the event. He obviously is capable of killing people. So maybe he's this mentally unstable person. Maybe he even is trying to kill Connelly, as people now suspect, because Connelly refused to give him an honorable discharge from the Navy or whatever. But regardless, he's the guy who does the shooting. So why is he then killed by Ruby? Well, initially, of course, you would think, the mob, the mob had this whole thing planned out, sort of made him the assassin and then eliminated the assassin. But I was thinking of something. Okay, so if you're in the organized crime and, you rig the Illinois election so Kennedy wins, kind of through Sinatra as your conduit, and then you think you're going to get a favor from Kennedy, but you don't. He turns his back on you, kind of sticks his brother on organized crime in general. I think a lot of people look at that and go, aha, there's justification for the mob wanting to kill Kennedy. I was thinking more like this. If you're involved with organized crime, you rig an election for the president, you still sort of have a relationship with the president. And,
thanks to Judith
really
Exner, among other people.
Yeah, the cross mistresses, right? Yeah.
And, I was thinking that perhaps, they also have some weird ethic that maybe is different than ours. The ethic being, well, we just can't kill anybody. We can't kill the president. We still, there's a weird kind of strain of patriotism, I think, sometimes in organized crime. So maybe what happened was Oswald acts alone and does this. And the people involved with the mafia are sort of like, hey, look, this guy can't do this. Like, we don't kill the president. This guy certainly can't. Like, this guy basically has ended our relationship with the White House. And basically in a sort of, kind of reasonable reaction of disgust, that is why Oswald ends up getting murdered so publicly. That it wasn't they were trying to silence him from talking. They were actually punishing him for going outside of sort of the framework they had created.
Chris Connelly enjoyed that theory.
I was listening to it wrapped. I think the questions about the theory would be like this: that Ruby was not well regarded by the mob, that Ruby had no connection or juice with the mob, and that because Ruby had attempted to Ruby ran a strip club, and a rival strip club had started an amateur night stripping, which was a violation of a union regulation.
Yeah.
And so Ruby attempted to get that changed, and in the prospect, and failed to do so because he had no connection to the mob, because the mob had no use for him, because he was a total chatterbox. He was the ultimate snitch. He was around cops all the time. He couldn't stop wanting to make himself famous somehow. And if you look at Ruby's actions in the hours before the shooting, he's all over the place.
Yeah.
He's not in place.
He's a crazy person.
He is jacked up on speed, and he does something crazy and impulsive.
The only part that makes me wonder about Ruby, like I was watching, they have those shows where it's basically it's the footage. It's just the footage edited in real time, but you're watching it after the fact. And they talk about, they're about to bring Oswald out. This place is in lockdown. I've never seen anything. Nothing can penetrate this place. And then Ruby shows up like 5 minutes before and just walks in, gets a catbird seat right next to where he's walking out and shoots him. But it doesn't make any sense when you watch the footage leading up to that. And all they're talking about is how the security is unlike anything. Nobody wants anything to happen to Oswald.
There are a lot of cops around, but there isn't a lot of security. Remember, Ruby has already been in the press conference.
Right.
Ruby's been all over the place, so he's a familiar face to the cops. They don't think there's anything wrong when they see him there. And the journalists have no idea who he is.
They don't think there's anything wrong with the crazy strip club owner?
They just think he's like a hanger-on. They think he's like, this is before we associated hangers-on with being like crazy and unhinged, So they just think. Now, I saw that live. I watched that with my family.
You saw the Oswald shooting live.
I
think my dad did too. It was amazing, right?
Yeah, my dad too. My dad saw it in a bar.
I think that's the first live televised murder in television history. And everyone saw it with his family in many cases, because it was all you were doing was watching TV after the assassination. The TV was on nonstop. We had guests coming over. We didn't even notice that the guests came in. You were just watching TV incessantly.
And it was on. I assume it was on all three networks simultaneously.
Yeah, that's right.
Is it the same camera shot?
I was surprised. The one thing, the documentary I saw, I was surprised by, because they did a cut in between the time Oswald came out and the time he got shot, and I just remember it as one continuous shot.
Right. I actually don't think on live TV that it showed Ruby popping out. There was another angle after the fact that I think.
It's maybe not. It's a 50-year-old memory. So
yeah.
But I remember the sound of the shot and Oswald yelling, "Oh!" And then I was watching NBC. We were an NBC family at the time, and I remember Tom Pettit saying, "Oswald's been shot," and just like total chaos going around.
I'm always amazed that he killed him with one shot. That it wasn't just to the stomach, like that you would die from that. It makes me wonder if he had a little help dying.
Well, they had a hard time getting the ambulance in, obviously, because the place was It was just insane. I mean, it was just.
So it could be just Oswald was a mentally ill, crazy person who was then killed by a mentally ill, crazy person.
I don't know that he. I mean, I don't know that he qualifies as a mentally crazy person. He was an obsessed guy. He was a guy who could plot and could plan. I mean, he was as crazy as anybody who kills somebody, I suppose, if you want to look at it that way. But he had what he I guess felt were his reasons, in the same way that he had reasons, as Chuck was saying, for shooting at General Walker.
I mean, he was very pro Cuba and very pro Castro, and the reason he shot at Walker Walker was kind of a fascist. He was a segregationist and a big staunch, anti-communist, but also was really adversarial toward Cuba. And I sense as time has moved on that the Kennedy administration's relationship with Cuba has kind of been amplified in terms of trying to understand this. I mean, maybe you'll disagree, but I feel that way.
He had Cuban and Russian connections, and those were the.
He was tapped in everywhere.
Yeah,
that was the thing. That was what I think Don DeLillo was. I remember in the 1980s, I was at Rolling Stone, and a story assignment came around. We used to have them on sheets of paper, and the story assignment came around in like 81 or 82 that said the Kennedy assassination by Don DeLillo, and it was going to be a piece about how the assassination had changed America's way of thinking from an American cowboy type view of the world to a European conspiracy-oriented view of the world. And that, I guess, was the basis for what later became Libra.
Interesting.
But I still remember kind of seeing that. And there's a lot of truth to that. And Chuck's own timeline in terms of how he felt about the assassination is a perfect example of what we all went through, reflected by the movies, reflected by popular culture, Parallax View and Blowout and all those movies that sort of played on the sense of conspiracy and hidden forces and all the rest of it.
And also, I think, sort of, this probably kind of falls in line with all of this, the changing social perception of the CIA.
Right.
Which when I was young, because like Lyndon Johnson seemed to think that the CIA was involved with this. And Kennedy had said he was going to splinter the CIA, so there is a motive. And when I was younger, I guess, I sort of perceived the CIA as sort of an amazingly unstoppable kind of force. But if the CIA wanted to do something, they succeeded at it. It was really their choice. And history has sort of shown now that the CIA is actually a pretty flawed organization. That, when you hear about the plans the CIA had to kill Castro, for example,
exactly.
Like the lunacy of some of these plots, their inability to succeed at a lot of these things. There's a book called Acid Dreams, which talks about the CIA's sort of investigation of LSD and hallucinogenics as like weapons, and it's just these bonkers things. So now it actually seems improbable to me that the CIA could have killed Kennedy if they had wanted to.
And that was the great lesson of that Church Commission in 1978, which was supposed to investigate the assassination. And what we found as a result, if I remember correctly, were all these plots that you're talking about. The poisoned cigar, the thing that was supposed to make Castro's beard fall out,
which would humiliate him.
Exactly.
He would be humiliated and he would lose power.
I mean, the irony of it is that we spent 50 years thinking that there's a conspiracy around John Kennedy's death. And the truth is, the conspiracies were around John Kennedy's life.
Mm.
His life was wreathed in conspiracy. Not just the stuff that they did to try to kill Castro, not all that crazy stuff, not just the obvious stuff regarding the women in his life, the conspiracy of silence that went with all that, but his health. One of the great passages in the Robert Caro book about JFK, about LBJ, the new one, is the number of illnesses, the number of ailments he was being treated for, the number of times he came close to dying, all of it regarding needing drugs and hospitalizations and nothing that ever came out.
And, I know you all saw Killing Kennedy with Rob Lowe. Tapped into that a little bit. I made Chris laugh. Now, it was a terrible movie, but they did have a couple scenes thrown in there where he's, lying down and getting shots on his back. And I think JFK was hopped up on painkillers, and I think his back was as bad as a back can possibly be.
Well, and that's why he had the brace on, and that that and the fact that the driver of the motorcade slowed nearly to a stop after the first shot may have had a lot to do with the injuries that he later received.
Well, let's talk about a couple parts to the going away for the conspiracy, just toward how the murder happened. The last bullet behaves differently than the other one. And some of the documentaries that break into this talk about how the bullet Oswald used was meant to travel and pass through things, right? But then the last bullet, the way it behaved was it basically exploded in his head. And it didn't behave like the other bullet. If the bullet that went through his neck and hit Connelly, which they've now proven Connelly, the way his seat was, there's no magic bullet. The Connelly, they didn't realize, was actually a little bit down,
inside,
a little bit to the left, and it was a straight line. That bullet went straight through, but then the last bullet exploded his head, which just seems weird to me. And nobody's been able to explain why the bullets behave differently.
Well, yeah, obviously I'm not a forensic expert, but I will say this, man. It seems like bullets behave erratically. you talk about the RFK assassination. There are people who say that where Sirhan was standing, there's no way he could have been the murderer based on where, like, the exit wounds are. It often reminds me sort of like, how you're trying to, like, build a fire in a fireplace, and sometimes it's just incredibly difficult to get it to work. You just can't get the fire going. And yet, if you have something you don't want to set on fire, and it's close to fire in any way, it inevitably does. It seems the same way with bullets. It seems like whenever a bullet is actually used in a scenario where we're not controlling it, where it just sort of happens, and we're studying its trajectory, it always is weird. Like it doesn't seem to do what science seems to dictate would be the most predictable route.
And the Mannlicher Carcano, which was the rifle that Oswald was using, had particularly, I guess, was known for having bullets that were especially different from each other, that would behave in different ways, as opposed to the usual group of bullets where I guess they're all very similar and act the same. The particular type of ammunition that was used was known as having a lot of variation in the bullets that were made, and so could react in conceivably different ways if you believe some of the forensics that.
Well, what about the fact that there were 3 bullet casings where Oswald was, but we only know about 2?
Well, everybody says there were 3 shots.
Right.
The question.
So where'd the 3rd shot go?
Well, now there's some belief there's a 4th, though.
That's true. Except the belief of the 4th, comes from, I guess, a lot of the echoing that took place at Dealey Plaza, and also that later discredited Dictabelt recording that came towards the end of the Church Commission's investigation, which was later to be found, which was believed to be an open mic on a motorcycle that was in Dealey Plaza recording 4 different shots, but which was later to be found to be, not from a motorcycle that was at Dealey Plaza, but at the Trade Mart.
Oh, no.
And was also discovered to have been recording after the assassination, because there's a voice that comes faintly on it that says, everybody stand clear until we're ready, which is some sort of command that a cop gave. And the person who figured this out was a rock and roll drummer from Ohio who bought a flexi disc that was inside a Skin magazine. The Skin magazine gallery had made a flexi disc of this recording from the Dictabelt. This drummer bought it in Ohio, played it really closely, and could hear this voice in the background. And that's how freaking crazy this whole thing gets.
And he turned out to be Dave Grohl.
That's in the Frontline episode that they talk about this a little bit. Yeah.
Don DeLillo said that the Warren Commission report is the Oxford English Dictionary and the Joycean novel of the assassination. He says there's a moment when you read it and when you see Jack Ruby's mother's dental records, you go, "Whoa, okay,
wow, okay. You guys did some work.
We are really, and that's, I think, the feeling we've all had as we've kind of gotten focused on this. You feel like you dropped through a rabbit hole.
Right.
You feel like you don't know what's true and what's not true.
I mean, it's just there's two really linchpin conspiracies for conspiracy theorists in general. Basically, the JFK assassination and the idea of the Bilderberg Group. And if you're involved with the idea that the world is being controlled by forces outside of you, you sort of need these two to be real. They have certainly the most sort of pragmatic, reasonable explanations as to why these things could exist. They've been thought about the most. They seem to have been discussed the most. And I think that this is part of the reason this one stays so much in the public consciousness, because if you are by nature a conspiratorial person or a believer in conspiratorial ideas, those are the two conspiracies you need to be true. And no one's ever going to accept that this is unilaterally, that the Kennedy assassination was just one crazy guy shooting another guy in a car. That will never happen.
Now, do you think now that after 50 years and after absorbing all this idea of conspiracy theories, that what we've now learned that is at some point everyone's going to talk? That because of, because of whistleblowers, because of celebrity, because of people writing books, there'll always be a Bradley Manning. There'll always be somebody who's going to say, actually, this is what happened. Actually, here are the documents. That you can no longer keep a conspiracy of any kind together 50 years after whatever may have happened in Dallas.
Well, I think
it's a really key time, because if you move back 30 years, almost no one sees this event. The only thing that we have to go by is basically anecdotal descriptions by journalists and sort of people and policemen at the time. If you move 30 years forward, if this event happens, in 1993 or whatever, then it's a totally different thing. It's like the likelihood of sort of bad information and good information being immediately sort of thrust forward is much higher. Like the time of 1963, I think, is also central to this. The beginning of modern media, but the very beginning. Yeah.
So that it's recorded as I think Tony Scott said in the Times, that it's significant that it's recorded on film, not on video, but on film.
Well, what do you think of the film? Because this is one of my favorite YouTube rabbit holes. I think Chuck and I have discussed this before, but I'm going to run it back, about people who believe the Zapruder film was doctored. And they have a couple pieces of evidence here. One is that the film existed for, I think, 2 years before anyone saw it. And supposedly it was shown to a group of people like a year before it was actually released. And the people who saw that showing claim that the limo slowed all the way down in the Zapruder film, basically to a stop, and then started again. But then in what you watch, the limo doesn't really ever totally stop. It gets going, and they claim that there were some cuts in there. And then the other interesting thing is that when he starts filming, doesn't necessarily mean he captured the entire assassination. Oswald might have fired a shot before he started filming. Like JFK could have come around the corner. He could have fired a shot. There's a whole documentary on one of the channels about it's called The Lost Bullet. I can't remember what it's on. And the theory of the whole documentary is basically there's this stoplight that's hanging down, and Oswald's first shot goes and hit the top of the stoplight and never reached anybody.
But if it had hit the stoplight, people would have heard the sound. And the people who heard the first bullet described it as like a firecracker or like a backfire from a motorcycle.
Right.
And if
there's a guy in the frontline thing who was on the 5th floor. He was one floor below where Oswald was. And he said it's 3 shots. It was bang, click, click, bang, click, click, bang, click, click. And he says it in a way that seems very credible to me.
And so the question is, and so the question is whether the first shot or the second shot missed, because the theory is that that the first shot that hit the people in the car was the so-called magic bullet, and the last shot, the third shot, was the shot that killed the president. But the question is, was the shot that missed the first shot or the second shot? The Warren Commission seemed to believe that the second shot missed.
Because of the time between the first shot and the...
But I've read other things, and this makes more sense to me along the lines of what you're saying, is that there are other people who feel the first shot missed, and they missed because there was an oak tree as well as that stop sign covering the area just as they came into view. And so there is a guy who's standing under the triple underpass, which is down the way, who is told like maybe 15 minutes after the assassination, "Why is your cheek bleeding?" And he doesn't realize that his cheek is bleeding. And the theory is that deflected first shot may have hit a tree branch or something. As Chuck was saying, bullets behave in strange ways. May have hit a tree branch on that oak tree, bounced off a curb, and kicked up, some particle of it kicked up and hit him on the cheek, because it is a straight line all the way from the...
Well, and also he's following the motorcade. He's got one eye closed, and he's locking it up with the other one. So right as he's about to shoot, if something came into view and he's moving his rifle with the car, it's possible like he just didn't see something in the last second and then it hit something.
I don't know if you guys feel this way, but I can't tell you on some level how frightening and terrifying like dipping into this stuff was, even when I was in high school. And even now it's even kind of unsettling, just because when it happened, it just, I mean, I was too young to be like upset, but it just knocked the pins out from under everything you kind of counted on.
It was a permanent distrust in government.
It's like the prism you look at the rest of history through, kind of. It really never goes away.
Well, because it's, I mean, particularly for you, if you saw the event as it was happening, you'd have been sick.
Yeah.
Okay. Like that, I can understand that, because I bet, I can't speak for Bill, maybe he would agree with me on this, but okay, I vividly remember the morning that the assassination attempt on Reagan.
Me too.
And I remember I was in 3rd grade, and the teacher tells us this, and she tells us this in this way that like very foreboding, this very terrible event has happened. But possibly because I was in 3rd grade, but the general thinking was like, oh, well, people try to assassinate presidents.
Yeah.
That's just part of being president. You know, you knew that Lincoln was assassinated. You kind of remembered, not the event, but you had knowledge that in the relatively recent past, a president had been shot. So I think for you, while that was an incredibly jarring event, because of this jarring event, for the people who came after, the idea of presidential assassination almost seemed intertwined with the job.
Well, I would also say just shootings in general, because when we were growing up, not only do you have JFK, but you had RFK, you had Martin Luther King, you had 2 attempts on Gerald Ford.
Right.
And it's, you know, and then the other thing that happened, I think, from your generation growing up, the 70s, think of how many movies there were about conspiratorial governments.
Absolutely.
It was like that generation was so affected by the previous decade. It was how many Robert Redford movies were there?
Oh,
like
my God.
4?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was really it. I mean, popular culture completely got around the idea that there had been a conspiracy somehow.
Right.
You know? It was an article of faith, kind of.
I mean, it could almost be a college course in university. I remember I took a Vietnam War movies course, and it was all about all the movies in the 70s and 80s that were from people affected by what you could do with the government conspiracies, too.
I, by the way, was interviewing George Thorogood at Rolling Stone in my office when Reagan was shot.
Oh, that's better than my story.
Where were you?
I think I was just home. I was waiting for my dad to get home from.
I had tickets that night for the NCAA final.
I was going to say, that was the big thing.
I had tickets that night for the final, and I was going to get on the Metroline or whatever they had then and go down to Philadelphia and watch Indiana and
North Carolina.
Yeah.
And Isaiah Thomas claims that he was, you know, it was Monday, so the game's that night. He's watching television in the hotel room. I don't even know what other player he's with, but, you know, it's like special bulletin from CBS News, and he apparently was like, oh, hey, the president just got shot. Game's canceled. And then it came on, and they were like, oh, my God, is the game canceled?
Yeah, and that was a big thing that whole day, whether they were going to cancel it or not. They probably should have postponed the game.
That's what I asked my teacher in third grade. I asked the teacher if they were still going to play the game, and she was like, I have no idea.
And remember, of course, it was the same night as the Oscars, which did cancel. Because there were like 4 or 5 years there where the Oscars and the NCAAs took place at the same time. And on top of that, it was the last broadcast of the NCAAs by NBC. So it was the last game ever broadcast by Enberg, McGuire, and Billy Packer.
So, wait, so back to the Zapruder film for a second. Do you trust the Zapruder film? Do you think it's been doctored?
I don't think it's been doctored, but there was a cut made from it, and it says a lot about what era we were living in. Frame 313. The frame that shows the bullet hitting Kennedy's brain, was considered just too much for America to handle. And so when, as I recall, when the Zapruder film first was made public by Life magazine, which had gone down to buy it, I think in the first 72 hours that it existed, because Zapruder was on local television in Dallas talking about it. They didn't think America could handle 313. So
is the premise of, when you ask if we trust I mean, I guess I do. My first answer is yes, I do. But let's say I didn't. What would be my assertion? That the footage we're missing would show the limo stopping and the driver was implicated in it? I mean, what are we supposedly not seeing with what we are seeing?
I'm not sure. I would just want to know why we just didn't see the whole tape from the start to the finish.
I mean, I think and of course, as we all know, it's the Zapruder film which has given sort of the greatest life to the idea that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll, who might have fired that third shot, because you can see what you want to see in the reactions and the movements of people, in those frames when they're under attack. And I think the movie JFK practically was built around the idea that the reaction of Kennedy after 313 indicated that a shot had come from the front on the right.
What's interesting is now that we have better HD and like they've been able to blow it up better, it actually seems like he moves forward first.
I think
for a split second, his head moves forward before it goes back.
And I think that's, that would tend to resonate with the idea that a shot had come from the back, although I'm sure there are other people who would feel otherwise.
I do think that's part of this whole thing, though, is that now that it's on YouTube and it's on all these shows, and it's about as grisly as it gets. It actually might be the worst thing that we show that people have become kind of immune to, but it's our president getting his head is blown off basically by the last shot, and we've shown that in documentary after documentary, and
Yeah,
all that stuff. It's pretty awful.
And and one of his children is still alive.
Right.
As much as we talk about it the way it's Caesar or Lincoln, it still has real personal resonance for people who are still among us. And so, I think there's a way today that the assassination is discussed that's different from the way it was in the 70s, in the sense that there isn't quite the same personal stake of it all.
Right.
That the unbelievable images that we saw at the funeral and stuff have kind of, washed away for us a little bit. Some of these people aren't with us anymore. But when you read through the descriptions of what happened afterwards, the personal tragedy for the family is just overwhelming. And
right.
it's hard to read still 50 years ago.
Chuck, what do you think about that? You forget about this. You always think it's just a Zapruder film. By the way, great name for a film, Zapruder. Like his name could have been like the Smith film. It would have been half as cool.
Would not have been the same thing.
But there's another film from the opposite side of Zapruder. I can't remember the name of it. And now that
it predates the shooting, though. Shows him going up the street and making the turn.
No. There's another one.
It shakes a lot, right? Is this the one where you can see him like there's something happens and the camera just goes crazy and it drops to the ground?
That's one of them, but there's another one that catches the final shot from the other side.
Oh. Okay.
And now that the technology or whatever, it's a lot clearer than it used to be. And it's basically from the opposite end of Zapruder. And after the car goes by, you can kind of see the grassy knoll a little bit, and there's nothing going on up there.
Well, I think there is obviously a conspiracy theorist who says that if you look really, really closely at some sort of image, and maybe you add some imagination, you can see a guy who looks like a cop. I think he's referred to in conspiracy theorists as badge man. One of those phrases like the three tramps.
Like Umbrella Guy?
Or like Umbrella Guy, which was, such an incredible story.
Yeah.
Umbrella Guy is such a perfect snapshot of what the world is really like. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just that crazy. Yeah. It's like a guy could have an umbrella in the middle of an assassination, open umbrella on a perfectly warm, hot day, on a day so hot that Jackie Kennedy looks at the underpass ahead and goes, oh, it'll be cool when we get under there.
Right.
And the guy has an umbrella, opens the umbrella at the moment the shots come out, and it's actually a reference to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement that the guy opening the umbrella believes Kennedy's father was in on with Neville Chamberlain. And that's why he's there. Crazy.
Is that true?
That's the story that Errol Morris. That's the story that Errol Morris tells.
Oh, that's right, in that short.
In his short, because that's the story that the guy told to the Assassination Commission in the 70s. But that's what life is like, right? It's like it's that crazy. Life is that random and crazy. And in a way, like Chuck was saying, the conspiracy theories, they in a weird way almost comforted us in a way. Surely the most powerful, most charismatic, handsomest man in the world couldn't be brought down by a loser. Couldn't be brought down by this mentally, defective washout that even the Soviet Union didn't want. Who came back and was angry. That couldn't happen. That's too crazy to understand. There must have been big malevolent forces pulling this off.
The same thing kind of happened with 9/11 to some degree, right? There was this whole faction of the country that felt like, well, it couldn't have been this simple. That these jerks just drove a couple planes into buildings. It had to be more than that.
I don't think that there's anything scarier in a way than if you really did believe all of life was chance. And that's sort of what that fear does drive these conspiracy theories. The idea that there must be some order. Like conspiracy theories do dictate a real amazing degree of order. If you believe that the Illuminati controls the music industry, the sort of framework that you're projecting that exists is so much more nuanced and sophisticated than the way the world really is. It's just kind of an impossible thing. And I guess the idea of Kennedy just being shot by a guy who just happened to have access to a gun and had his own interior reasons, that really does sort of, push the idea that life is chaos and life has no meaning.
But you would say, of all the people who we have tragically come to know as assassins, all the damaged, hurt, messed up people who have killed the people we admired or loved, no one appeared to be more complex no one's history was stranger than Oswald's.
The Tupac of assassins?
Oswald, Oswald just had touched so many strange things. He'd been in the military. He'd done so many. He had
Cuba, Russia.
He'd passed through so many like hot button touchstones of the era that it's why I think he, for so long, has remained this figure of mystery.
Well, like look at Sirhan. That hasn't had 1/1,000,000th of the interest from a conspiracy standpoint than JFK did. And granted, there's no Zapruder film, but everybody chalked that one up to a crazy person.
And there are because like the conspiracy with Sirhan is so much heavier. It gets into the idea of mind control and the idea of sort of like an agent who didn't understand what he was doing, who was because he had coffee with someone earlier that day. I think it's that the casual person, when they hear the conspiracy involved with Robert Kennedy's assassination, it seems so weird and so sci-fi that they just sort of shut down. The JFK one's not like that. The JFK one seems reasonable to a reasonable person, weirdly.
And Reagan, I think, was the easiest one to believe because it was like, oh, he loved Jodie Foster. He was a lunatic. Okay, done.
There's no great conspiracy about the attempt to kill Reagan. And I don't know. Maybe you remember this, Bill. In the first week of Grantland, I wrote a piece that forwarded a possible conspiracy about Reagan's assassination.
I remember that. Yeah,
but it was just too weird, so we never used it. It's just sitting on my hard drive.
It would have been a weird way to start that first week.
Welcome to Grantland.
that was sort of the thing. It was sort of like I don't know where we would put it. And then it just sort of and then it was going to be it was almost going to be, I think, like a weekly column where we were just going to present possible conspiracy.
It was
theories,
like called Chuck's Conspiracy World or something like that. Yeah. By the way, I haven't given up on that idea. Don't think I've retired it. I thought it was going to be monthly.
We still have that one. The Reagan one's still waiting to be used.
I'm sure the Michael Jordan one's standing by too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, the Michael Jordan one writes itself. We'll get the full story in that 50 years later, I feel like.
Well, that's the thing. That's just what was saying. It's like you were saying. Some documents will come out. Something will emerge that will all make it clear. And I think we know that that's not going to happen.
I mean, am I wrong for remembering it that way? I always felt like they were like, oh, yeah, at the 50-year anniversary, that's when we'll release some
because
stuff.
The Kennedy family, took great pains to put – there's a lot of stuff, from the family that's not supposed to come out for another 50 or 100 years. And what came out again in the 70s was that the FBI and the CIA had held back a lot of stuff from the original. The FBI destroyed a note about some encounter they'd had with Oswald. Those services had not cooperated with the Warren Commission in the way that maybe some people.
So it might have been covering up.
Yeah, to
culpability.
Yes, it was a CYA. We should have
known and we didn't.
Very much, yeah. I mean, I think that was the idea.
I still want to know what happened in that hour in the hospital when, it's just so unsatisfactory about how the bullet behaved in his brain. What did it have in common with the other bullets?
I mean, what I think happened? I mean, one of the things that's true about both the time in the hospital and the autopsy is that Jackie Kennedy is in the room for all of it. It's like, what are you going to do when the widow is, when the potential widow is there? I think even the doctors talk about feeling, constrained to some degree.
They said they didn't want to turn him over, stuff like that. Half of his head's hanging off.
I mean, they didn't shave the head to do the autopsy because the family was considering an open casket funeral. I mean, I think the stress and the shock of it, even for experienced professionals, clearly took its toll on the doctors and on the cops and on everybody involved. And I guess you can't, I guess you can understand that. But
so, what would be the craziest possible conspiracy that could actually be true that would blow the most people's minds about this?
I think you're about to talk to that guy, aren't you?
Well, no, that's the second. We have Bill James. I think the craziest would be if LBJ was involved. I think that would be the one that would stun me the most.
As it strictly applies to this event?
Like
what would be the
something came out.
No, the craziest thing, I remember all the conspiracy theories that came out right away. And the craziest one I heard was that Kennedy had survived and that, in fact, he had attended the Truman Capote black and white ball that he threw for Katharine Graham. That was the single craziest one that I heard.
Survived.
He had survived, and he actually went to the party that Truman Capote threw to
the Zapruder film.
Well, there is a really crazy story. I don't even think we can talk about it on this podcast.
Sure, we're here to talk about conspiracies.
Involving LBJ that would explain why we don't have a clear sense of what actually happened to Kennedy's skull, and that there was that an event happened on Air Force One.
This is an old Paul Krasner story, right? That ran in. I
don't know.
Yeah, you don't want to go there. That's for sure.
But that would explain why we don't have a clear image of what the skull.
What do you mean? LBJ's not alive. What's he going to do? Sue us from the grave?
No, you don't want to go there.
Okay,
promising you.
Can I Google it later?
You'll be able to find it readily. I mean, the thing that's very one of the most compelling parts of the Caro book, the LBJ book is LBJ's efforts, LBJ's conversations with Robert Kennedy, like just a couple hours after the assassination, in terms of what procedures should take place regarding swearing in and what to. And
they hated each other, right?
And the true fire of their hatred would burn based on these two conversations.
Yeah, and then in the plane after, like. Didn't RFK? He was somehow involved at some point. I remember reading about this.
RFK is at his house when he gets the phone call.
Yep.
With Robert Morgenthau, who would go on to become the DA of New York and stuff. And LBJ calls him twice to I don't want to get this wrong to get him to sign off on procedures that he's going in terms of the swearing in. But depending on who you listen to, either LBJ is depending on whose version you believe, either LBJ is doing the right thing in terms of checking with the highest law officer in the country to make sure that procedures are being followed, or humiliating and torturing a man at the worst moment of his life. Reminding him that his beloved brother, the president, has just been killed, and being insensitive. And it would be the two different views of those two conversations that would set forever their great opposition. Not that they didn't dislike each other before that.
What do you think that Oliver Stone's movie has done to this story 22 years later?
When I think of Oliver Stone's movie, I think of Tommy Lee Jones' amazing performance as Clay Shaw, and I see Sissy Spacek turning off a lot of lamps and saying, "You care more about John F. Kennedy. You care about your own family."
And Kevin Costner's terrible accent. That was a good Sissy Spacek.
I mean,
you have to imagine me in a cardigan.
I liked it.
That movie did, though, really, I think, totally mainstream the idea that the average American thinks a conspiracy happened with JFK. That I think before that movie, there were people who was like, of course, and there were people like, who, I don't know, but that movie sort of creates the perception that most of America believes that something else happened.
Chuck, I actually disagree with you.
Really?
I think that movie was designed to make people feel that if JFK had lived, we would not be in Vietnam. I think the conspiracy theory was part of what the films of the 70s and the 80s were. I think the point of that movie was to say, had JFK lived, things would have been different, and we would have never gone into Vietnam.
That's possible. I'm not saying that it was Stone's attempt. Like, he was like, I need to validate the sort of the questions about this. But if somebody said to me, what's the main takeaway from that? I think if we talk to people younger than us, if we talk to somebody who's 17 years old, and we're say, what are things that you know about John F. Kennedy? I think the fact that he was shot and there was a possible conspiracy would be the first two things.
The great romance was always that things would have been totally different had Kennedy lived. And that's the fascinating thing, particularly for those of us who've made our livings over the year following popular culture, is that how would the popular culture of the 60s have been different if Kennedy had been around for all of it? How would the generational showdown have been different if the president hadn't looked like LBJ, but had been a handsome guy in his 40s?
Would have been good for Raquel Welch.
I remember the 60s were pretty good for Raquel Welch all on their own.
Throw in a little presidential affair. It would have been even better. The Stone movie, though, Dan Fierman thinks it's one of the most important movies of the last 30 years Because it directly challenged, I don't want to steal his point. I don't remember the exact point, but I think it was like, because it directly challenged conventions and brought something to the surface that had been considered, kind of this underground, these wackos talking about conspiracy. And now all of a sudden it was this popular culture thing. It led to the Seinfeld, and it just made it mainstream for a whole new generation. And just was such a different movie, than the type of movie. It was basically like he was this, here's my theory of the conspiracy, and I'm acting it out with this 2.5-hour movie.
I just remember that all the conversation, all the interviews that were done with Oliver, because of his background, because of Platoon, because of his stated politics, were all about the idea, his committed belief that Kennedy was going to get out of Vietnam. He could show you this document. He could point to this speech. He was convinced that if Kennedy had still been alive, that we would never have gotten embroiled in Vietnam, which is a faith exercise.
Yeah.
You just don't know. But that for him, I think, was a big part of the animating, factor. Yeah. That everybody else got this Baroque sense of, because maybe it wasn't in people's minds the same way it was in the 70s. The idea that everything was a conspiracy, that everything about the government was tied.
And there was another shift, I feel like, in the 90s, and you see this with movies like Slacker is a great example of this, where the idea of conspiracy theories moved from being a dark subject to an interesting, fun subject, where the idea of speculating that, that we've been to the moon many times since the Apollo missions, or all of these things, that while not necessarily real, there isn't anything sort of it's not scary anymore. Like I don't feel as though conspiracy theories are a scary thing for people who like to talk about them.
I think
feel
that's
like
right.
Now they're a fun thing, and I don't think that was probably the case in 1971.
I think that's the distance from the actual crime in this case. Yeah, I think that's true. Is it becomes
I just
kind
came
of a power
across
game.
a conspiracy theory today because I knew we were going to talk about this. I was just kind of looking around the internet. Did you guys ever hear this theory that we're actually living in the 18th century?
What does that mean?
Apparently, there is a belief that the calendar, with the Gregorian calendar we use, which we always accepted as flawed, is actually very flawed. And the years 600 to 900 AD did not happen. And that essentially we are moved ahead 300 years in this timeline, and everything that we know about that period of time is essentially a fictionalized story.
If that means that the paper I turned in for senior year isn't really late, that's a great thing.
Yeah, you've got like 270 years to get it in. I guess.
So Betty White's 300 years younger.
Yeah, but I thought that it was essentially because it's a real harmless conspiracy theory in some ways. I mean, if it turned out it were to be true, I don't know what the real downside would be. But I mean, like some people have speculated that like rulers from a certain period wanted their reigns to be more meaningful, so they just said, we're going to say we reigned for 300 years and moved up the calendar, and that everyone else just kind of adopted it. And the human nature is to basically go through and fill up these blank spaces so that anything that supposedly happened from 600 to 900 either didn't happen at all or happened at a far different time.
I think that's what they did with the 9th season of Dallas.
They did. They woke up in the shower.
When they had Bobby Ewing in the shower saying it was all a dream.
Didn't the Vikings reign from 600 to 900? I thought they did. So the Vikings just keep losing.
I guess. But Joe Kapp was still the quarterback back then.
Although the idea with the Vikings would have discovered the New World in like the 1300s, though. So that would have been 400 years.
I do remember going to parties where we would go around the room and say, who does the world think is dead who you think is still alive?
Well, what did you think of this latest Andy Kaufman thing, Chris?
I didn't buy it.
His daughter.
I didn't buy it.
I didn't either.
I didn't buy it.
She was an actress.
I didn't buy it. I have to say I didn't buy it.
Was it actually now validated? I mean, I didn't believe it either, but it's interesting how how someone is still trying to keep that alive. They really want that
people
to
in the
be
family.
part of the conversation.
Yeah,
but he is always going to be the subject of that because it's so he's a perfectly legitimate answer for this little parlor game we used to play.
The one you could always talk me into in 2 seconds, especially after one drink, is Tupac.
Even with the autopsy photos?
I don't care. You could still talk me into it.
Okay.
So, for the most part, I think people who are dead are dead.
Chuck, did you have one?
I don't believe D.B. Cooper is alive. I would love to think that he is, but I don't. I'm trying to think of other.
Or the Birdman from Alcatraz.
Because for one thing, this game is always interesting. It's always like the goalposts are always kind of moving. Like some people who may have avoided death despite our knowledge are now dead.
Right.
It's like,
yes.
like let's say Jim Morrison had somehow lived.
Right. Jim Morrison.
Not died. He might be dead anyways at this point.
Yes. The Eddie and the Cruisers thing really got Jim Morrison's name out there in a big way. My answer always used to be Dan White.
Dan, the San Francisco guy?
Yeah.
You think he faked his death, possibly?
Well, I just always thought that his convenient suicide after getting out of prison was, if there was anything that was suspicious, that was it. Because
great movie idea.
It just seemed like that was very convenient for everybody. But that's just me.
I like it. So, over the next week with all these shows that are coming out, have we mined all the territory? Is this it? Are we done with the JFK assassination after this week? I feel like this is it. This is the end of the road, as Boyz II Men once sang.
Why do you think that?
I think 50 is like the last magic number. Then after that, you go to 75 basically, and by that time, pretty much everybody who was like Chris, like 6 years old when it happened or whatever, or even like the children of that generation, I'm not sure people care anymore.
I think the stake in the game is different. I think the feeling that your life would have been different changes, because you think about everything. You think, if Kennedy is still alive, what happens with the Beatles?
Right.
If Kennedy is still alive, like, what happens with the space race? What happens with the challenge of the generation? If Kennedy is still alive, do you still, like, push back against everything that the establishment stands for? Does all that stuff still happen if Kennedy is still alive? Or do you need someone who's so different, like LBJ, so that everybody rises up and objects? That's the big question.
I wonder if the kind of person who would have kind of sort of kept this conversation alive is now moved over to like being a 9/11 truther or something like that. If the nearness of that event, which, certainly has an equal, or you can even say probably much greater significance in terms of how it impacted the culture in the country. I wonder if that would become sort of the de facto conspiracy minefield that new person now is walking through. If that has replaced because now when you think about it, what would be a more relevant fear, that our own government was involved with the destruction of the Twin Towers, or our own government was involved with killing a president 50 years ago?
Fair points. I hate the 9/11 truther thing, so I'm not a good person.
Well, I think the difference about 9/11, and maybe this is true in a sense for JFK too, is that 9/11 is everybody running for their corners. Everybody go to your corners. People saw 9/11 through the worldview they already had. And if your worldview was extreme in one or two directions, 9/11 had to fit into what your worldview was. I think JFK, his assassination changed your worldview, shook up your worldview in a way that never got put back together the same way. I think 9/11, depending on how you look at it, ratified your worldview somehow. As upsetting as an event it was, it may not have changed the way you looked at the world in the grand sense. It made you feel more vulnerable. But in terms of its explanation, you tended to go back to what you believed before in terms of why things took place.
Would you say with the JFK assassination, it ushered in the modern era of TV? It was like the first chapter?
Well, I thought, I kind of feel that way about the space race. Anytime a guy went into space, we were watching TV. You know, if John Glenn was in space, we were watching it. If Alan Shepard was in space, we were watching it.
What were you watching?
You were watching the coverage of the blast-off. You were watching the coverage of the thing. They were on live. Where is he now? You know, this idea that JFK's assassination was the first time we all went to television, I feel like is kind of anticipated by what was happening in space. That was the most,
I of course was not alive during this period, but when we talk about the modern age of television, whenever I talk to people who really do remember the first time they saw television, the first time it was in their house, it almost seemed like the era of television starts instantaneously. Like from the moment people had the ability to have that medium in their home and to have this kind of combination private collective experience where they were watching something privately, no one else is there, but they know it's being shared with the rest of the world. It almost seems like it just happened in the same moment, that similar in some ways with the internet, where the transformation was so profound and that it just almost instantly started changing the way people live.
The one thing
I don't know if they needed I don't know if there necessarily needed to be events to make television a central aspect to how people understand reality. I think as soon as they showed up, it did.
The one thing you would say, though, is that the content of TV was always extremely conservative and not groundbreaking. So much of TV in that whole first era is vaudeville moving over to television, radio moving over to television. I guess what I think of is...
But with major technologies, though,
true,
the instrument matters more than the content. I think this is why television and the internet are comparable.
Well,
it's not the content that's changing things. It's actually the machine that is changing the way people experience the world.
And the one I would say if I was going to find a moment that started the new age, it's the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. Because the moment that changes is the moment when we go to a different economy where young people have money to spend. That's one of the things that Mad Men's done really well, is gone from the idea that old people were making buying decisions to the moment when young people make buying decisions. And that's really the moment, if you were going to find one, where the baton is passed.
Well, and also like the invention of the teenager, which the Beatles being on Ed Sullivan is sort of like almost the end of that transformation. Where if you go back into like the 30s, you were a child and then you were an adult. That was it. There was no middle period of life. And then the 40s and 50s altered that, where like kids had cars. So they could go through these sort of formative experiences at 14, 15, and 16. And kind of the art they were interested in was different than their parents. And then the Beatles really sort of said, like, okay, this is a way a young person believes and thinks and lives. And you can really see it now. And like when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, the teenager had been totally invented. That was it. And time moves on from there.
A lot of losers with the JFK assassination. Only a couple winners. Yep. Walter Cronkite, biggest winner probably.
Yeah, it's true. You know, we watched NBC, so we didn't see Cronkite. But in the aftermath, you know, Cronkite's the guy who, I wonder if it's just that CBS saved all of its footage. You know,
that's part of it.
You know how they used to get rid of so much footage
He really nailed it.
Days?
It was an amazing reaction. Like, it actually gets you choked up 50 years later watching it. Like, he's legitimately and genuinely affected and was having trouble trying to be the rock of the show. It was amazing.
And for a guy who began his career covering a big disaster in Texas, you know, the thing that you realize now is and it's not a negative thing, what a great performer he was. His cadences were spectacular. I mean, just as a guy who read something, the way he read it, the way he would say things, he was like a great actor. He was like listening to James Earl Jones or something. I know he's a journalist. I know he's a great, but just as a guy on TV, he was a compelling guy on TV.
Totally agree.
Was Nixon the biggest winner of this, though? Because in all likelihood, Kennedy wins again in 64 if he doesn't die. 68, then, well, it's possible LBJ runs. It's also possible that the whole world is different. RFK follows JFK. Does Nixon never become president if Kennedy is not shot?
I think it all depends on whether or not you think the youth rebellion, all the liberation movements of, happen regardless of whether Kennedy is elected or not, whether Kennedy lives or not. And I think they do. I think we still go into Vietnam because I think he's still, the concept of the Cold War, the opposition with the USSR was so huge. It reflected everything. It was the space race. Everything in sports was about us versus the Soviets. They packed the LA Coliseum in 65 for a foot race between Jerry Lindgren and somebody else. When Jerry Lindgren won in 1964, Bobby Kennedy is there crying because it's such a victory for America.
So you think we're in Vietnam regardless of whether this happens?
I guess I do, because I
do too.
And I think if that happens, the youth still rebel, and I think Nixon still has a great chance of saying, I'm going to put a stop to all this in 1968.
We were talking about rabbit holes before. I've been through 2 different Vietnam rabbit holes. Once just the rabbit hole itself, but then the movie rabbit hole. I don't think once it got going, I don't think there was really any way to get out. It just would do all the different forces that were tied into it.
Not for those guys and not for what their past was.
It just couldn't have happened.
In the way that everybody fights the last war, these are all guys out of World War II. They were all like conditioned, It's hard to imagine Kennedy. For me, people feel differently. It's hard for me to imagine John Kennedy pulling out of Vietnam.
You know who was another big winner from this, weirdly? The Dallas Cowboys. Because the community of Dallas took such a hit after this happened. They were so embarrassed by this. They basically had to reinvent themselves through some other means. And it kind of ended up being the Cowboys franchise. They sort of became the face of the city. They made people in Dallas feel good about being there again. And that was just on the sort of just predates before the NFL sort of becomes this national phenomenon and sort of supplants baseball as the national sport. There's a big, like 800-page book on the Dallas Cowboys that came out last Christmas about. I read that. There's also a new book about the same size about Tom Landry. Both these books really intimately talk about how the Kennedy assassination sort of changed that community. And it seems as though it made them look for something in the popular culture to sort of get behind, and it ended up being that team.
And Larry Hagman.
That was later. They seemed to benefit. The TV show Dallas seemed to benefit from the Cowboys franchise.
And the
those two big games. That's a really interesting observation. Those two big games with the Packers too. First, the one the year before the Ice Bowl at I guess the Cotton Bowl, where the Cowboys can't get in from the 5, and then the year later in Green Bay, the Ice Bowl. Those really made the Cowboys a national team, a team that was seen as being the great rival to the Packers.
Also seemed sympathetic at the time because they had these sort of big failures.
Yes, that's right.
Last big winner, although probably also a loser, Abe Zapruder. Becomes, I would say that's one of the most famous names, top 50 most famous names. You say the name, people just instantly think of one person. But I bet he didn't capitalize off that film like he could have.
He sold it for $150,000 to Time Life, which at the time was a lot. They made 3 copies.
But imagine if he had sold it like for 1 year and that's it. Didn't he sign over the rights, right?
He made, well, I guess made's a weird word. He is involved with something that will live forever.
That's why he's a winner.
Not many pieces of art that are like that. I mean, I would say he's a huge winner from this in terms that his cultural significance will never, it may erode, but it will never disappear.
I have him behind Cronkite. But I do think if he had played it better, it could have ended up like the St. Louis Spirits owners.
Well, I mean,
he just could have been raking in money for generations.
Really, when you say Cronkite, Cronkite already had his job. It was really this guy Dan Rather, who no one had heard of before.
Oh yeah,
who was a Texan and who was on the ground there for a lot of that.
Another winner
who became very well known as a result of his coverage, in the same way that Arthur Kent became known from that first Iraq, that Kuwait War.
Oh, remember who was the girl?
Scud Stud.
Who was the lady?
Ashley Banfield from 9/11, I think, right?
I thought she was going to be a bigger winner than she ended up being. She had
weirdly though, like Arthur Kent, they kind of. I mean, where is Arthur Kent now? Should I know where he is? I feel like these people kind of disappear now. These journalists, celebrity journalists, who kind of come into the public eye because of the event they're covering. Except
for Dan Rather, who's now kind of seems bitter that CBS wasn't involving him more in the assassination stuff, which I thought was interesting.
But that's kind of predate. I mean, that was a while ago. That's a way back.
No, but then it happened again recently. He said they airbrushed him out, all this stuff. All right, we have to go. Chuck, thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot.
We appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. All right, we're going to take this to a part 2. We're going to have Bill James, and we're going to have my buddy Jacko. We're going to keep the JFK assassination talk going. But first, a word about our friend Stamps.com. What an awkward segue this is.
I thought you did it very well. Actually.
Thank you. Do you go to the post office?
On occasion, yeah, just to see if I'm still listed in the wanted thing.
Okay. Well, you don't have to go to the post office anymore. Just use Stamps.com. Put in the BS on the top right of the website. You can join. You get $55 off postage. You get a free scale. Just print it out. Have your kids print it out for you if you don't know how to print it out. Print out the postage. It's holiday season, Chris Connelly.
There are a lot of Christmas cards got to go out from the Connelly family.
Print out your postage. Buy the boxes somewhere else. Do everything at home. Skip the lines. That's my advice for you for holiday season. Stamps.com. Check it out. Part 2. BS Report coming up.
Target to set off. Whoa.
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNradio.com.
Peace out.
Hey, what you got there, Golick?
The new Subway Chipotle chicken melt with guacamole.
Man, that looks good.
Yeah, this new guac is really bringing the flavor.
Got one for me too, right?
Well, yes and no. Mostly no. Well, really, all no.
Try the irresistible new Subway Chipotle chicken melt with guacamole, juicy grilled chicken strips with Monterey cheddar, Chipotle Southwest sauce, and new guacamole made from ripe Hass avocados with just a hint of jalapeno. Subway, eat fresh.